Good morning, everyone. So I presented some of my preliminary findings on this last year, but I'm excited to share with you the full suite of our results, range expansion, improving elephant well-being, and facilitating reciprocal ecosystem recovery. So overall, this study evaluated how a resident elephant population in a private reserve in South Africa's Eastern Cape responded to range expansion through fence removal. So we assessed it spatially, ecologically, behaviorally, and physiologically. Our objectives were to first assess the spatial responses via GPS collars, pre- and post-fence removal to identify any shifts in home ranges, new area occupation, seasonal movements, and herd associations. Next, we assessed behavioral responses, including changes in aggression, stress, vigilance, and affiliation, as well as activity budgets, so the percentage of time in different behaviors, and then we compared that to other key predictors of behaviors such as sex, age, or group size. We then assessed ecological responses, so using GIS and Landsat imagery, we evaluated vegetation growth and browsing pressure, and looked at habitat selection parameters, all of this pre- and post-fence removal. And lastly, we looked at physiological responses, so looking for stress hormones in dung of elephants, as well as other physiological indicators such as temporal gland streaming and body condition. All right, so this occurred in the Kariega Game Reserve in the Eastern Cape, so nearby. Some of you might be going there in a few days. It's classified as an Albany thicket biome, and it has an elephant population of about 76 individuals. So over the course of a few years, over the course of 2 years, Kariega, which is a private fully fenced reserve of about 11,500 hectares, they removed 2 of their internal fences. So the first fence removal was on the eastern side that had about 21 elephants at the time. And then on the western side of the reserve, separated by an internal fence, there was a population of about 55 elephants. The first fence removal increased the land for the elephants on the eastern side, but did not introduce the 2 herds. And then the second fence removal introduced the 2 herds. So first we identified the elephants, as many as we could, creating an identification database. We then used 14-minute focal samples of individuals, recording both count and duration-based behaviors simultaneously. And we used GPS collar tracking, so we applied GPS collars to elephants on either side of the fence, so matriarchs, and then we used GIS and Landsat imagery to look at normalized difference vegetation index and habitat suitability modeling. And then lastly, dung sampling for fecal glucocorticoid metabolites, which is a stress hormone present in the dung. So overall, we were able to fully identify 69 of the 76 elephants. We had 607 focal samples, 32 months of movement data via the GPS collars, and 138 dung samples. So once the first fence was removed, it did not introduce the 2 herds, but it took the collared bull 10 days to enter the new area, the matriarch 36 days. However, the larger one that did allow for integration of the 2 herds, it took 15 days for one of the herds to cross, but then 60 days to fully cross into the new area. The second herd, it took 64 days to even cross the fence line, and then 92 days to fully cross. These are elephants coming from the western side to the eastern side. The western side was more densely populated with tourism and elephants. However, the elephants on the eastern side, it took 15 months for her to fully cross over into the new area. So we did see that elephants were moving from the more densely populated side of the reserve to the less densely populated side. When we look at home ranges, pre- and post-fence removal, so we see that pre-fence removal, elephants on either side of the fence were both preferring the southern region as a yearly average, and we see increased hotspot activity and high localized pressure. However, post-fence removal, you can see that the home range shifted to encapsulate much more of the reserve and a lot less intensity of those localized hotspots and browsing pressure. When we look at this individually, so leaders of the herd, when we look at elephants that were on the western side, so the more densely populated side, we saw that post-fence removal, their home range shifted quite significantly from that hotspot region in the south to be more western, northern, and central. However, when we look at elephants that were on the eastern side of the reserve, so the less densely populated side, we saw only a slight shift in home range, so only moving slightly northward and slightly eastward. So here is a short video of the year following fence removal. So after fence removal, we saw elephants moving over to the eastern side, utilizing this area quite a bit as it was newly accessible to them. However, now we start seeing this general movement from east to west and north to south, which is a lot more indicative of a natural population and with less intensity occupied in that southern region that we were seeing pre-fence removal. So yeah, that was 1 year of movement following fence removal, and we now start to see these coordinated seasonal movements from north to south and east to west. So when we look at seasonality, we can see that pre-fence removal, so the elephants on the western side, again, the more densely populated side, their seasonality was focused primarily heavily in the south in the winter region, the winter time of year, and then in the north in spring and summer. Post-fence removal, we saw a bit of a change, especially in their seasonal movements, particularly during the winter, where before it was localized to the south and now has moved to the east in winter. But then when we look at elephants on the eastern side of the fence, so the less densely populated side, we saw minimal change in seasonal movements. And then this can have implications for the best times of the year for fence removal. If you are going to remove fences, this could facilitate when you would kind of encourage those natural migrations. So then associations pre and post fence removal for elephants that were once separated by a fence, we saw moderate interactions between the newly introduced herds, so about 1,000 proximity alerts within a year. And something really interesting we saw was that elephants who were not previously separated by a fence, we thought that after the fence came down they would spend less time together, but they actually spent more time together. So that was something interesting that we found. So spatially, we concluded that we saw a redistribution of density, so elephants moving from more crowded sides to less populated areas, easing those localized hotspots of pressure, expanded home ranges, again, reducing localized hotspots of impact and supporting ecological balance. Seasonal shifts, so we saw a marked variation in seasonal movements, especially for elephants on the more constrained side. Renewed social connections, so previously separated herds were interacting, and then we had stronger herd cohesion generally. And then eventually a return to familiarity over time. So elephants, although they did incorporate the new area, they over time then incorporated into their seasonal movements. All right, then when we look at it ecologically, we looked at the normalized difference vegetation index, so that looks at the amount of greenery on the reserve. The red indicates gain, the green indicates no change, and the gray indicates a loss. So this first one is prior to fence removal. So you can see there's some localized losses and gains that you'll see naturally in an environment. The second square indicates fence removal. So after fence removal, you saw some strong gains, so some strong red in the area where the elephants were moving away from. And then we did see some localized losses in the areas that the elephants were moving to. However, a year following fence removal, we saw that those localized losses recovered and that we had an overall net gain in vegetation index on the reserve from pre to post fence removal. All right, then when we looked at habitat suitability modeling, we saw that the suitable habitat was centered on this eastern side of the reserve, so elephants were moving towards that region of higher habitat suitability. However, after the fence was removed, you had a greater distribution of habitat suitability overall, so the habitat suitability for the reserve increased overall. And then another interesting thing we found was that the habitat selection by elephants, so the variables that they used of high importance in selecting habitat, actually increased. So pre-fence removal, there were 12 variables of statistical importance for the habitat they were selecting. And then post-fence removal, they increased the number of variables that they were using to select their habitat to 18. So before pre-fence removal, they were selecting habitat based upon temperature, slope, precipitation, but then post-fence removal, they were incorporating other elements, including seasonality and elevation. And we saw this for all of the elephants collared. So this has implications that they're utilizing a greater variety of habitats that could, again, reduce localized pressure and encourage natural processes. So our ecological conclusions that we did see a net ecological gain, and also localized losses were recovered following fence removal, enhanced habitat suitability for the reserve as an entirety, broader habitat use, so greater selection of environmental variables when elephants are selecting habitat, which again may disperse impact more evenly, reduced localized pressure because of this, so decreased concentration browsing and more natural regeneration processes, and then overall increasing conservation value. So identification was quite a labor-intensive process, but we were able to identify 90% of the population. I include this because we found that identifying the population actually allowed for greater accuracy in statistical assessments overall, and also assisted in some management interventions. When we look at behavior, we saw that elephants on the western side, so the more densely populated side, exhibited increased stress-related and vigilant behaviors. And then the ones on the eastern side that had reduced tourism and a reduced number of elephants, they had increased exhibition of aggressive behaviors, though rare, as well as affiliative behaviors. So this is pre-fence removal. When we look at post-fence removal, we saw that there was a statistically significant reduction in foraging by about 24.3%, and then an 108.7% increase in locomotion, so statistically significant, as well as an increase in vigilance by 93.6%. And this reduction in foraging and increase in locomotion could again reduce localized pressure, pardon me, and encourage natural, social, and spatial behaviors. So, sorry, a little under the weather. So when we look at the effects of, thank you. When we look at the effect of fence removal immediately following fence removal on behavior, then we looked at it 300 days post-fence removal. We saw that active aggression increased significantly immediately post-fence removal. However, it declined by 20% 300 days after fence removal. Passive aggression did not show a statistically significant influence by fence removal. However, 300 days after fence removal, it did also decline by 35%. Stress-related behaviors initially rose significantly after fence removal. However, they were only about 12% higher than pre-fence removal periods 300 days later. Vigilance significantly increased post-fence removal by about 103%. And vigilance is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just showing that they're responding to a greater set of stimuli within their environment. Affiliative behavior also increased significantly after fence removal and rose by 66%, which was sustained 300 days after fence removal. So our behavioral conclusion showed that it didn't have a massive impact on stress, that there was an increase in vigilance as they adjust to new conditions. There was an improved activity balance, so this decrease in feeding with the increase in locomotion suggests healthier ecosystem dynamics and elephant well-being. Although there was an initial spike in aggression, it was followed by an overall reduction. And social cohesion strengthened, so again, an increase in affiliative interactions. And overall, these combined patterns highlight that reducing crowding pressure was restoring some natural patterns and healthier behavior repertoires. Lastly, we looked at the physiological impacts, so temporal vein streaming, so the temporal fluid streaming from the sides of an elephant's head, indicating heightened arousal, increased significantly following fence removal. There was an increase in body condition score health. No change in musth behavior, however, data on this was quite limited. When we looked at the stress hormones present in the dung, so the FGCMs, we saw that there was a statistically significant reduction in stress hormones in the dung for all age and sexes combined. And this reduced stress hormones may also be attributed to that decrease in aggressive and stress-related behavior. When we separated by sex, we saw a similar reduction that was statistically significant. And then when we separated by age class, we also saw a statistically significant reduction in stress hormones in the dung. Looking at it temporally, we can see here the blue line indicates pre-fence removal, and the orange line is post-fence removal with the dotted line at the time of fence removal. So we can see that drop in the stress hormones in the dung following fence removal. And then we saw an initial spike during that time, potentially because of the fence removal procedure itself, which took about a month. So our physiological conclusions that we saw reduced stress levels on a physiological level, and that was also reflected in our behavioral assessments as well. So this can have implications for increased well-being for the elephants, but that also has implications for human safety and sustainable wildlife tourism. We saw a temporary stress spike during the fence removal period, and that's just indicating that acute response to disturbance, but it was followed by a sustained reduction. We had increased temporal gland streaming, which showed elevated rates of just stimulation to the environment, and then overall improved body condition scores for the elephants in the reserve. I want to thank everyone who made this research possible, and yeah, I don't know if there's time for questions. Pardon my